know. It's not worth it.
Okay, it's about time to start. Okay, I think it's 5:30. Do you have a question? Anyone have a question before we start?
Homework's gonna be turned in before 10 p.m. Don't worry.
Okay, good. I think it's, you still got time. Okay, so we're continuing membranes and transport today. Are there any questions from last from Monday? And then you probably saw my announcement. We're gonna, by the, well, we'll see. Between today and tomorrow evening, they're hoping to install a second air purifier in this room. Because there's been problems with people having allergy problems. So hopefully that will help. Let's see. All right, so we left off yesterday discussing different types of membrane proteins. Well, not yesterday, Monday. So we talked about protein A would be intrinsic protein or integral protein, where it spans polar regions, hydrophobic regions, and polar regions. So it's going to have amino acids that interact with those groups. So the polar regions here will also in this protein be have polar amino acids, and they can be charged or not charged, acidic or basic. This part of protein A, which hangs out the lipid bilayer, in contrast, would be rich in hydrophobic amino acids. And then we talked about this protein here that has two different subunits. One part would be mostly polar and have mostly polar amino acids. Part B would be mostly hydrophobic and have mostly hydrophobic amino acids. And then protein C would be similar to D and E. Okay. And only proteins A and the heterodimer G with B might be transporters across the membrane. And just recall this topic, lipids, and in the previous chapter, and this one would be the last topic for our exam on October the 10th. So not this Monday, but the following Monday. So we're going to see some pictures here. And so some membrane proteins will be mostly alpha helical, and some will be beta sheet. Okay. And so this example of an alpha helix that we're representing as a cylinder. Okay. And they're just showing you it being mostly intrinsic in this example. Same with this beta sheet. So we see beta strands here. Can anyone tell me if it's parallel or antiparallel? Yes, it's antiparallel because you have the arrows going in opposite directions. So this would be the amino terminus here, C terminus here, and the amino terminus and C terminus. Very good. We haven't talked about that in a while. Now, this is showing you what kind of the actual structure of the lipids that would be in the membrane. Sorry, or how a protein would be attached to a membrane. So this example of a protein attached to the membrane will go, sorry, the wrong way. Go back to this figure here, where we may have a protein attached to a lipid in the membrane, and then we have our protein. And that's shown here, where this part would be the membrane, and you may recognize this as glycerol here, the CH2O, CHO, and CH2O. And then we have two fatty acids here. But position 3, instead of having a fatty acids, which would be a triglyceride, okay, we have a phosphate and many sugars, another phosphate, and look, we have a peptide bond here. Okay, so here's the peptide bond, and then we have an alpha carbon here, okay, an amino group. Okay. So we can see that there was an amino acid here that has a hydroxy group. Okay. So some proteins aren't like really directly touching the membrane in this example, and they may be bound to, in this case, a glycerol phospholipid, and then some sugars, and then you have the protein. So it's far removed from the membrane, but it's attached to it, indirectly attached to it. Now they can predict, if they know the amino acid sequence of a protein, the primary structure, they can predict which portions of the protein would be more likely to be in a membrane and which portions would not be in a membrane by doing a hydropathy plot. So they can look at a hydropathy plot and they can plot amino acid number in the protein position versus free energy of transferring to water. And we'll see on the next graph, if something has a positive delta G when you transfer it to water, that means you have to put energy and force it to be in water. So that's going to be your hydrophobic amino acids. If you have a free energy when you put an amino acid in water, it's so happy to be in water, it's releasing energy. It's like, yeah, this is my place to be. Okay, so that's your polar amino acids. So this is an example of a hydropathy plot. I changed the axes to match my PowerPoint description on the previous slide. So I have free energy of transfer to water. We learned earlier in the enzyme chapter 6, I want to say, that free energies that are negative are spontaneous and favorable, because that releases energy. So anything below 0 here has a free energy of less than 0. So that those amino acids of that protein are going to like to be with water. Okay, you don't have to, this is an example of a protein called glycophorine. You don't have to memorize this glycophorine. But this is an example of protein that has regions that their free energy when you transfer the water to water is negative. So these parts of the protein would be interacting with either side of the membrane that's polar. Okay, well in contrast, it does have very few peaks that are positive, but that means you have to put energy to force those amino acids of that protein into the water, so they don't want to be there, so they would be more likely in the lipid bilayer. But so that means for proteins that cross the membrane, like intrinsic proteins or integral proteins, they're going to have peaks below and above 0 in free energy. But proteins that are on the peripheral side or only interact with the polar heads, as like protein E or C, they're not going to have free energies greater than 0. I'm going the wrong way. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. So fully extrinsic proteins, okay, or peripheral proteins, they're only going to have peaks with negative free energies because they like water. So those peripheral proteins that are hanging out by the polar heads, they're only going to have negative delta G. But proteins that span the whole lipid bilayer, which includes polar regions, hydrophobic, and polar regions, are going to have both types of peaks. Okay. Very rarely would you have a protein with only positive delta G's, because that means it doesn't touch the polar heads at all. So in the future, you may have to recognize such a graph and determine if it's intrinsic or peripheral. Are there any questions? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure. This because this is a big room. Okay. So then we're going to talk about lipids moving in the membrane. Recall the membrane is a semi-solid. Okay, and that's going to be important for enzymes in the membrane that catalyze reactions so they can move. Okay, but since lipids make up most of the membrane, we discuss lipid movement in the next couple of slides. Okay, and we talked about membranes being more rigid if you're you have a long chain fatty acid, and whether you have double bonds or not. Remember, the more double bonds you have, the more fluid it is. Okay, and less rigid. But then cholesterol can remedy that and make it more solid. Okay. So this is just looking at lipids moving themselves. So the highlighted lipid, they were interested in following its movement. And it does move from left to right, which is called lateral diffusion. So it stays in this half of the membrane, but it can move left to right. Which is transverse diffusion means it goes to the other layer. either from, in this case, it goes from bottom to top, but it could have gone, I'm sorry, from top to bottom or bottom to top. But that's rare for a polar head to cross the middle layer here and go to the other side. Does anyone know why that would be rare? What's the polar head have to cross through? Non-polar region, so it's not going to want to do that, just like not the creamy Italian salad dressing, but the regular Italian salad. The regular Italian salad dressing, it always separates out the layers. So the same here, it wants to stay where it has like molecules. It doesn't want to have to cross this layer here. That's going to cost energy. But it does sometimes for like blood clotting. It's been known that phospholipids in the membrane will flip to help mediate blood clotting. Okay, now this is talking about other molecules moving, not lipids, but other molecules that need to cross the membrane to either enter the cell or exit the cell. Okay, so some molecules will have a negative free energy, or in other words, be spontaneous in their movement across the membrane if they're small, uncharged, and not polar. Okay, or they can be a fatty acid. They also will cross the membrane easily, in addition to being small, uncharged, and not polar or unpolar or non-polar, is if the concentration is higher on one side or the other. Most molecules like to go from high to low. Okay, I like to spread out. Okay. If they go from low to high, we'll see that cost energy. Okay. And I already talked about them being non-polar, which another word for is lipophilic. Okay. We're also, so if they're going from high to low down in the membrane, it's not going to cost any energy, but sometimes you have to use direct or indirect ATP if it's going to go from low to high, and we'll see examples of that. We're going to discuss protein pumps that require ATP to allow a molecule to cross the membrane. Okay. We'll compare that to facilitated diffusion, where energy is not involved, but you need a transporter because it's too big, or it's too big, or it's too polar without protein. So you still need protein assistance, but it's still going from high to low, so it's facilitated. Active is if it's going against its gradient, then you need ATP, no matter what kind of molecule it is. So I found that also bigger, but we have two types of transport. It's much simpler than we're talking about enzymes. So you have passive or diffusion. The molecules are going down the gradient and they don't need a transporter. Okay, so that's usually a lipid-like molecule, and it's small, and therefore it's not charged either because it's a lipid-like molecule. Facilitated transport, it needs some help, but it's still going from high concentration to low concentration. But the problem is it's either too big or too polar because of the lipid bilayer it needs help. Active transporter, a molecule is going against its gradient. Sometimes it does use direct ATP. Other times it doesn't need direct ATP, but it needs a protein transporter and another molecule, but that molecule is going down its gradient. And we'll see a cartoon. This is just all words here, but we will soon see a cartoon. But again, I'm still defining passive. But passive diffusion, again, no energy, no protein transporter, but it does increase as you increase the concentration. Okay. But again, it's going to have to be nonpolar or hydrophobic molecules that are small that would not need a transporter at all to cross the membrane. Okay, and then facilitated again requires a protein transporter, but again, all molecules are going from high to low concentration, but they're not lipid-like and they're not usually too small. And then active goes against its gradient. That means we're going from low to high. You're like swimming upstream, okay, or you're walking into a crowd of people, okay, if you're a molecule. So it's going to use ATP directly if that's the only molecule using that transporter and going against this gradient. But sometimes there's coupled transport, meaning there's two different types of molecules using the same transporter. And if one's going down this gradient, it's paying the bill for the other one to go against this gradient. Okay, and that's still active transport even though you don't see the ATP. And we'll see, I keep saying we're gonna see examples, eventually we will. But if we're now, so this is where it shows you how, like, this might remind you the enzyme chapter where you graphed with, well, you did the line we work where you're doing it, someone promised me. But you're fine. I think that's fine. And then, does it feel like it? We don't lose it now. I know we gain now. Okay. But so this will kind of remind you the enzyme chapter, because when you talk about protein transporters, they're catalyzing the movement of molecules across the membrane. And so you can pull out velocity of transport versus concentration of the molecule you're transporting. So in this case, if they do that without doing reciprocals, it does look like McKelly's method again. And this kind of graph you can see for active or facilitated transport that involves a protein. You would not see this for simple diffusion. It's actually linear. We'll see that. But they do protein transporters make transport very fast. Okay, but they're very specific. They're like enzymes, and and we can tell that because we can get a Vmax, and if you can get Vmax, you can get half Vmax, and then you can find the concentration at which you get half Vmax. Now they put KT there. I would change it back to Km because really you didn't need to change it to K of transport, but Km is again the concentration we need to reach half Vmax of the substrate, the transport of substrate. So these kind of, if transport looks like this, whether it's active or facilitated, that means we can have competition, which is good. Sometimes we need to slow down transport if we have too much of a particular molecule in the cell. We don't want any more. So it can have competitive inhibition where the Vmax will stay the same, but the Km will increase because you need more substrate to get in, down, compete the inhibitor. Some transport may get activated. Okay, examples LDL, which carries cholesterol in the cell, but that cell already has lots of cholesterol, it's not going to let any more in. Okay. So they can be regulated. You can have regulated transport, just like you have regulated enzymes. Now I have added a little line here. This would represent simple transport or diffusion, which doesn't require transporter, so it doesn't require protein. So its rate is linear, but it will never approach the rate that you have for active or facilitated. So active or facilitated look the same on this type of graph, okay, because it's only looking at velocity versus concentration of molecule to be transported. It's not looking at free energy or anything like that, okay, or energy required. So active, you can't, so if I showed you a graph like this on the exam, all you could tell me is not simple diffusion, the hyperbola. You could only tell me it's active or facilitated and needs a protein transport. That's all you could tell me. You couldn't narrow it down any further. Unless I told you it requires energy, then you would say it's active. Whereas this one's always going to be simple diffusion. It's never going to get as high as active or facilitated. It's going to be super slow. It's like an uncatalyzed reaction. And because you can never get a Vmax as it keeps increasing, but at a slow rate, since it never stops, you can never find a Vmax. You can't divide it by 2 to get half Vmax. Therefore, you can never find a Km, which means it's not specific. You know, I can spill apple juice, cranberry juice, which would be bad, stain something, Kool-Aid or whatever. It's still going to diffuse. Okay. You know, but we don't usually watch and stare diffuse. We put it and clean it up, especially if it's going to stain something. But, so this is like supposed to be data that I'm showing. Now this one's interesting. It's looking at concentration of sodium and the rate that glucose comes in the cell. So we're going to see that some transporters will transport more than one molecule. So in this case, as sodium concentrations increase, glucose is allowed to enter the cell at the same time. And we'll see a cartoon of how it works. But again, we get this hyperbola, so we could estimate Vmax, find half Vmax, and find Km, which again, the smaller the number, the more specific the enzyme is for that reaction. Okay, you can bind at lower concentrations. Because Yeah, we talked about alcohol dehydrogenase and how some people stay still red because they only have the enzyme that has a high CAM, so it takes a while to get the acetaldehyde out of their system. So guess what this is? What does this remind you of? This graph. You did it for your homework or you're about to do it. Lineweaver-Burr. So transporters, because they act like enzymes, you can, since they have a hyperbola when you plot velocity versus substrate concentration, if you plot 1/v versus 1/s, you get Lineweaver-Burr. And so here where we hit the y-axis, you might recall that's 1/v max. And where it hits the negative x-axis, that's -1/km. And so if we wanted to find those values, that would be 1/-0.25, and we do the reciprocal to get the km. Would that be 40? You take the reciprocal of that, and then where the 1/v max is, like, let's see, that's not 0.025, maybe 0.03. If you take the reciprocal of 0.03, you get your V max. So this is kind of a good chapter to re-practice. In case I show graph and you have to find V max. Any questions on that? You feel comfortable with enzymes? We love enzymes. And just like enzymes can have an inhibitor, so can transporters. So now we have two lines here. It says one's with inhibitor and one's no inhibitor. They share the same 1/v max, so therefore the V max is the same. Their KMs are different. So since the V max is the same, do you think it's non-competitive or competitive? It's what? They're different answers. Here we go. So they have the same V max. So if we add enough substrate, we keep adding more and more substrate, we're going to get the same V max. We can pick that inhibitor out of it. One more change there, Mike. Competitive, so it's competitive. Okay. Unfortunately, we can't do that in the parking lot when it's full. Like the more cars you have, you get your spot. Okay. Or the more people in your car, you get your spot. Okay. All right. And you're doing something similar for that assignment, but everyone's doing pretty well. So now we're going to talk about mechanisms of transport. Okay, and these apply to whether it's facilitated or active. Okay, whether we need ATP or energy of somebody else or no energy required. This applies to either type. It never applies to simple diffusion because it's just drifting across the membrane without any assistance. So uniport, that transporter is only transporting one molecule at a time and only one type of molecule. So that's not too bad. You need one. Symport, it's two molecules using the same transporter and they're going the same direction. Maybe they're both entering the cytoplasm from the exterior of the cell. They're both entering the matrix of the mitochondria. They're both leaving the matrix of the mitochondria. Antiport, they're using the same transporter, but they're going to different locations. Maybe one's leaving the cell as one comes in, kind of thing. Okay, so this symport, antiport, and uniport is independent of active or facilitated diffusion. Just because you're facilitated doesn't mean you're going to use uniport necessarily. So some cartoons here, okay, and I don't know, some shade of green here. We have three different transporters, and uniport, as it shows, we just have this molecule, one molecule being transported. Symport, we have two molecules being transported, and they're going to the same destination. You and your friend decide to go see me. Antiport, port means door, kind of thing. One transported molecule is going below the membrane in this case, and one's leaving, whatever. So again, I don't have any concentration gradients here, so they could be facilitated or active, but we don't have enough information to know. Now this gets, I got lazy here, and I put 2 and 3. You know, what's 2 and 3? So if you want to number these, 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, I got lazy because it wasn't going to fit on the slide, and now I got another slide. So so for active transport, if you have symport or antiport, they could, if you're so for active transport, for to require active transport, and you're using symport or antiport, one of the molecules is going against this gradient as the other one's going down this gradient. And the one going down this gradient is providing the energy for the other one to go against this gradient, then you don't need ATP. But if it's active transport, both molecules are usually going, if it's active transport and you need ATP, then they're both going against the gradient. So, so if it's going to be facilitated, which is not here, but for active transport, both 2 and 3 have to be going against the gradient, or one molecule is helping the other one with only one going against the gradient and the other one is not. And we'll see the sodium potassium pump as an example where you need ATP, but it's active transport, but you need ATP because both are going against the gradient. One's being kicked out of the cell, one's allowed in the cell against the gradient. Number 1, which is uniport, if they're going down the gradient, then it's facilitated. But if it's only one molecule and it's going against the gradient, it's always going to require ATP, and it's always going to be active transport. There's no other molecule to help it except the transporter with ATP. Okay, so we'll look at the sodium potassium pump on the next slide. This summarizes it here in words, but it's easier to see the cartoon. So, so here's our transporter. And now I put in these triangles. Your book uses the symbols for sodium potassium, but I would like to show you both ways that gradients are shown. So this is the outside of the membrane at the top. Below the membrane is the inside of the cell. And what we see is if we look at the sodium's leaving the cell, and they have one molecule of sodium here, and it's going to where there's 6 sodiums. So is that going down this gradient or against this gradient? Against. What's the potassium doing? There's 2 here and it's entering 2 to 4. So it's also going, since they're both going against each other and they're using the same transporter, neither one can help the other one with their own energy because they're both going against each other. They both need energy to go in. So the sodium potassium pump, sometimes it's called a pump, has to use ATP to help them both go against the gradient. So that's the way the transporter is paying the bill for them both to go against the gradient. So this is one way to show the gradients by showing you writing out the molecules and showing more here. If you look at the sodium and less here. But also you may see in other sources triangles used to show concentration gradient. Which the widest part of the triangle, the widest edge of the triangle, we have to get what's called, because I haven't had geometry in a long time. You don't know what it's called. I want to know if you told me the right answer. So the widest, what? Okay, yeah, that sounds familiar. A bad memory. Okay, thank you. So this part of the triangle would mean it's high concentration, and where it's pointing would be low concentration. So that's another way to show the concentration gradient. So I try to make it the same color as the sodium. So it's high this way and low here, but the sodium is going from low to high. And the same with the potassium. I try to match the colors of the book had. I added those triangles. So you may see triangles or sometimes all these other molecules. But the main thing is that both are going against the gradient, so there's no way that each other can help each other. So again, transporter called sodium potassium ATPase, or so sometimes they just say sodium potassium pump, which infers that they're using ATP to help them both. So that's an example of active transport where you do need ATP. And you probably, if somebody took physiology, you might know that this causes the outside of the membrane to have a net positive charge, and the interior of the plasma membrane facing the cytoplasm have a negative charge. And during the action potential, if you take that class, but if you didn't, don't worry about it, the polarity changes, and then it gets more positive inside the cell and negative on the outside for a little while for the action potential before we can talk to the next neuron. It talks about secondary transporters here. The sodium potassium pump is an example where one molecule helps another one cross the membrane. And with that one was active transport. We're gonna also look at the movement of glucose. Glucose can enter the cell two different ways. One requires active transport and one does not. Now, and probably you'll probably recognize that it's normal for us to have high blood glucose and have it enter. So it's normal for glucose to go from high concentration to low, because when you eat, like right after a meal, your glucose, especially if you're bad, like when you have carbs, then you have a higher concentration in your bloodstream until it's taken up and then it goes into the cell. So that's normal. So normally insulin will help glucose enter the cell. It's from a higher concentration. So, but there are transporters for glucose to go against this gradient if someone's hypoglycemic. So this is just showing you, this is kind of reiterating what antiporters look like versus symporters. But again, that's independent of whether they're active or facilitated. Here they don't give us enough information to tell you if it's active or facilitated, because they don't give you any concentration gradients. But look at it now we're seeing this here. Now here we see the sodium pump, potassium pump, where we said that the transporter is investing ATP to help sodium go against this gradient and leave the cell or go to the extracellular matrix and causing potassium to come in. Well, there's an ulterior motive for that. They're investing energy in having the sodium go out. Why? So it can go down its gradient and help glucose enter the cell. Notice glucose going from one molecule of glucose in this example to 3. So it's going against this gradient, but I don't see any ATP over here. What it's using is the energy that the sodium potassium pump invested in having sodium go out against this gradient. Now suddenly when the sodium goes down, it's providing that free energy going, oh, I'm going down my gradient now. I can help glucose come in against this gradient. Again, I suspect this transporter is not as commonly needed, because usually you're not low in sugar. Okay, you're either normal or hypoglycemic. Like one time, don't ever eat French fries right before you have a blood test. But I didn't know at the time. I didn't know we were having a blood test that day. And so, yeah, so then they didn't believe me that I just had French fries, but they did. I checked at home later, it's normal, but they made me come back. They checked it again, and then they did that test that's longer, where they look at whether your hemoglobin has glucose on it. And H1, that was fine. They didn't believe me, but I wasn't hypoglycemic. I actually go hypoglycemic. Oops, that thing does that all the time. Okay, so and so here they're talking about channels. Okay, so for some ions, they always go facilitate. They always go from high to low. Like there's channels for calcium, for muscle contraction. They always go from high to low, but they can be regulated. Now this is going to show you a different type of transport. And when we say receptors here, and in case you took cell biology, we're not talking about the receptors like the receptor tyrosine kinase pathway that's in cell signaling, or the GPCR pathway that's involved in cell signaling, or RTK. Don't worry about that. But these receptors are kind of different, and leads to molecules being brought in the cell like in packages. Okay, and specifically we're going to be talking about LDL a little bit, low density lipoprotein. And you probably know that brings cholesterol to organs that is not the liver, in contrast to HDL, which went like years ago when I was a student in New City and I kept blood tests. I know they used to say HDL was the good cholesterol and LDL was the bad cholesterol. I hope they don't still say that. Do they still say that? Yeah, used to say they shouldn't do that, because that's like an oversimplification. HDL carries cholesterol to the liver. It's a protein. LDL is a protein that carries it. Actually. So, proteins can't be really good or bad, like in cartoons and stuff. But anyway, so this receptor is responsible for binding LDL, which it carries packages of cholesterol. And hopefully, if there's normal amounts of cholesterol or low amounts of cholesterol, the cholesterol will come inside and can be used. If it's higher amounts of cholesterol in the cell, it's going to like reject it and not let it. Okay. But yeah, it still uses that. That's funny. They still use that. So this is a cartoon of it here. So here's LDL receptor. Here's LDL carrying the cholesterol, because cholesterol is very hydrophobic. It can't go in the cholesterol by itself because it's mostly water. But if the cholesterol in there is not too high, it says, oh yeah, you can come in. But so LDL binds the receptor, then it's a receptor mediated endocytosis. So the whole LDL comes in with the cholesterol, and then usually the lysosome then will free them from each other, and then the cholesterol can be used as part of the membrane, especially if you eat what kind of fatty acids? Saturated or unsaturated? Close. Unsaturated, because then you have less hydrophobic interactions, so the cholesterol can fit there. Also, the cholesterol, if this was the liver, which is not because it's LDL, but cholesterol can be used to make hormones. Now, in times of high cholesterol inside the cell, then LDL can't bind the receptors because actually what happens at this step here, instead of allowing the receptors back out, they're not allowed back out, they're actually destroyed in the lysosome. And you may have heard in other classes, or will, at least in my chemistry 449 class, which I don't see as many here today, I see a couple. We'll learn that there's a disease called familiar hypercholesteremia. And those people have super high cholesterol without eating French fries. It's like 600 to 800. So yeah, and sometimes with the doctor, I had a friend that the doctor don't look at her report and know that she's that way. So they were kind of scolding her initially about her diet, and then they have to go to her and they can't help it because what happens is the receptors are defective in some way and they can't bind the LDL in the first place. So it's always circulating the bloodstream. So then, they're always they have to take a medication for that. But yeah, and you can tell the doctor has that report. But yeah, nowadays, since they have genetic tools to screen for that now, so they can put people on cholesterol lowering medication at a younger age, because some people having heart attacks and strokes in their 20s or 30s, if they're both genes mutated. So they have to check for that if it's not in the family, just like they do for the breast cancer gene. Any questions on membranes and transport? Well, I was looking at the syllabus and we're a little ahead. We're not really supposed to start carbohydrates till Monday. So I was just going to leave, normally just leave the rest of the class for questions if you have questions. If you don't have any, that's okay. Because I don't really want to be too far ahead because that's not going to exam, but we will start at Monday. But it won't still not be an exam, but I don't want to put a whole bunch of new stuff right now. If you have any questions, I can stay. But otherwise, I'll start carbohydrates on Monday. I don't want to get that far ahead. And then that's the way some of you might have time to submit your homework. Just kidding.
If we submitted it early and you gave us feedback.
Yeah, it's just by the due time. Yeah.